They hanged an innocent man in Red Hollow, and no one spoke his name again. Not until the night the truth came back wearing dust and silence. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from. Because stories like this don't belong to one town alone. They belong to anyone who's ever seen something wrong and chose to look away. And if you believe justice doesn't always come with a gun, stay with me, because this one rides quiet. The wind moved slow across Elias Carter's land that evening, dragging lines through the dry grass like fingers across old scars, the kind that never really fade, just settle deeper into the skin. And Elias stood by his fence line, one hand resting on the rough wood, the other hanging loose by his side, watching the sun drop low enough to turn everything gold, and then something darker, something heavier, like the land itself was holding its breath. He had lived out here alone for 9 years, 9 long winters and summers that came and went, without asking him what he wanted. And in all that time, nothing ever came to his door unless it needed something or meant trouble, sometimes both. So when he saw her standing there at the edge of his property, not moving, not calling out, just standing like a shadow that refused to leave, he knew right away this wasn't a simple thing. She wasn't more than 20, maybe less, wrapped in dust and something that looked like the remains of a long journey. Her dark hair pulled back loosely, strands falling across her face, her clothes worn but held with a kind of quiet dignity that didn't belong to someone begging for help. She didn't wave, didn't step forward, didn't even try to close the distance between them. She just waited, and that waiting carried more weight than any shouted plea ever could. Elias didn't reach for his rifle. Not yet. He'd learned that fear showed itself too quickly out here, and once it did, it never really left the room. So he stayed where he was, watching her the way a man watches a storm rolling in, measuring distance, reading signs, trying to understand if it would pass or break over him. The air smelled like dry earth and horse leather, the last heat of the day still clinging to the ground, and somewhere in the distance a crow called once, then went quiet like it knew better than to interrupt what was about to happen. She took one step forward, then stopped again, like crossing some invisible line cost her more than it should, and when she finally spoke, her voice didn't carry fear, it carried something else, something steady and sharp and worn thin at the edges. My father, my brother, did that, and the words hung there between them, not loud, not dramatic, just heavy, like a truth that had waited too long to be spoken. Elias didn't answer right away, because he didn't know what that meant yet, but something in the way she said it told him he already did, or at least a part of him did, the part he kept buried under years of silence and long days that never asked questions. She raised her hand slowly, like she was offering something fragile, and in her palm rested a silver necklace, dull from time, but still catching the last light of the sun just enough to make it seen. And that was all it took, just that small glint, to pull something loose inside Elias that he hadn't touched in a long time. He stepped closer without thinking, boots pressing into the dry dirt with a sound that seemed too loud for the moment. And as he got within 10 feet, he could see it clearly now, the shape, the worn edges, the way the chain bent slightly where it had once been pulled too hard. He knew that necklace. He had seen it before, years ago on a man who stood in the middle of Red Hollow with his hands tied and his voice steady, even when no one else's was. A man who kept saying the same thing over and over, not loud, not angry, just certain. And Elias had stood there back then too, not speaking, not stepping forward, just watching as the town decided what truth looked like that day. The memory didn't come back all at once. It came in pieces, like broken glass catching light in different places, the sound of boots on wood, the way the air had felt tight in his chest, the look on that man's face when he realized no one was going to stand with him. Elias blinked once, hard, like that might push the past back where it belonged, but it didn't move. It stayed right there, sharp and clear and heavier than before. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice lower than usual, not from fear, but from something closer to recognition. And the girl didn't look away, didn't hesitate. She just answered. It belonged to him, and she didn't need to say the rest, because Elias already knew which him she meant. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the ground, turning the space between them into something narrow and unavoidable. And for a moment neither of them moved, because some truths don't rush forward, they wait, they settle, They force you to stand still long enough to feel their weight. Then, from somewhere beyond the ridge, came the faint sound of horses, distant but steady, the kind of sound that carried purpose, not wandering, not passing through, and the girl's eyes shifted just slightly, not in panic, but in understanding, like she had been expecting that sound all along. Elias heard it too, felt it more than heard it, a rhythm in the ground that spoke of men who knew exactly where they were going. And he turned his head just enough to catch the edge of the horizon, where dust began to rise in thin lines against the fading light. 3 riders, maybe more, still far but closing, and suddenly the space between past and present didn't feel so wide anymore. Elias looked back at the necklace in her hand, then at her face, and for the first time since she spoke, he saw it clearly, not fear, not shame, but resolve, the kind that comes when someone has already decided what they're willing to lose. He took one slow breath, the air dry and heavy in his lungs, and something inside him shifted, not loud, not sudden, just enough to move him from standing still to stepping forward. "Come on," he said quietly, turning toward his house without waiting to see if she would follow. Because some choices don't ask permission once. They've been made, and as the sound of approaching horses grew just a little louder in the distance, Elias Carter opened his door, not for trouble, not for mercy, but for something that had been waiting along. Time to be finished. The door closed behind them with a sound that felt louder than it should have, like the wood itself knew something had crossed into that house that would not leave the same way it came, and Elias moved without hurry, setting a lantern on the table and striking a match, the small flame catching slow before settling into a steady glow that pushed shadows back just enough to reveal the lines in the walls, the years in the floorboards, the quiet life he had built to avoid nights exactly like this. The girl stepped in but did not sit, did not lower her hand, the silver necklace still resting in her palm like it carried its own gravity, and for a moment the only sound was the wind brushing against the outside of the house, testing the edges, looking for a way in. "What is your name?" Elias asked, not looking at her at first, his eyes fixed on the table where the light fell strongest, because names mattered out here. Names carried weight, and some names came with stories that did not belong to the person who wore them. "Lila," she said, her voice quieter now, but not weaker, just closer to something real, and Elias nodded once, like he was placing that name somewhere inside his mind where it would stay. "Lila Redbird," she added after a second, and that last word hung in the air longer than the first, because it told him where she came from, what people would see when they looked at her, what they would assume before she ever spoke. Elias finally lifted his gaze, studying her face, the way her eyes held steady even now, the way her shoulders stayed square despite the dust and the distance she had traveled, and he could see it then, not just courage, but decision, the kind that comes after something has already been lost. "You came a long way to say those words," he said, and she gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgment of something that could not be undone. Outside, the sound of horses came again, closer now, the rhythm clearer, each step pressing into the ground with intent, and Elias turned his head slightly, measuring distance the way a man learns to do when land is the only thing between him and whatever comes. "Next, they will not stop," Lila said, not as a warning, but as fact, and Elias did not ask how she knew, because he already understood the kind of men who rode like that, the kind who did not turn back once they had decided on a path. He walked to the shelf by the wall and reached for a tin cup, pouring water from a jug that had been sitting there since morning, the sound of it filling the space between them in a way that felt almost normal, almost like any other evening, and he set the cup down in front of her without a word. She looked at it, then at him, and for a second something softer passed through her expression, something like surprise, not at the water itself, but at the simple act of being offered it. She took it slowly, her fingers brushing the rim before lifting it, and when she drank, it was careful, measured, like she had learned not to take more than what was given. Elias watched that, the way she held herself, the way she moved, and it told him more than any explanation could have. It told him she had been alone for longer than a girl her age should have been, that she had learned to carry things without asking for help, that she had come here not because she expected saving, but because she had run out of places that would listen. The lantern flickered once as the wind pressed harder against the walls, and Elias stepped back to the table, his hand resting near the edge, not touching the necklace yet, but close enough to feel its presence. "Tell me," he said, and it was not a command, not a demand, just an opening, a space she could step into or leave empty. Lila lowered the cup, setting it down with care, and for a moment she looked at the necklace in her hand like it might speak for her, like it carried the story better than she could. Then she drew a breath, slow and steady, and began. 10 years ago, she said, her voice finding a rhythm that matched the quiet in the room. A man passed through Red Hollow. He did not belong there, but he did not cause trouble either. He worked for a few days, kept to himself, and people started talking, because that is what they do when they do not understand something. She paused, just long enough for the weight of those words to settle, then continued. My father and my brother were among those who talked the loudest. They said he had taken something, said he did not earn what he had, and the town listened, because it was easier than asking questions. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. Not new, not surprising, just familiar, like an old wound remembering it was still there. I was there, she said, her eyes lifting to meet his. Not in the crowd, not close, but I saw enough, I heard enough, and I believed them, because they were my family. Her voice did not break, did not falter, but there was something in it that carried regret without needing to name it. Outside, the horses slowed, the sound shifting from distance to presence, hooves finding firmer ground as they approached the house, and Elias could almost picture them now, the way they would ride up without hesitation, the way they would expect the door to open before they even knocked. Years passed. Lila went on, her gaze steady again, and things began to change, small at first, stories that did not match, details that did not fit, and I started to see what I had not seen before, what I had chosen not to see. She closed her hand slightly around the necklace, the metal catching the lantern light once more. This was found among my father's things, hidden, not worn, not spoken of, just kept. Elias reached out then, slow, giving her time to pull back if she wanted, but she did not. She let him take it, and when the metal touched his skin, it felt colder than it should have, like it had been waiting. He turned it over in his hand, tracing the worn edges, the slight bend in the chain, and there was no doubt left, not anymore, just a quiet certainty that settled deeper than any question. The horses stopped outside, the sound of leather and breath filling the space just beyond the walls. And for a moment, everything inside the house seemed to hold still, waiting. Elias set the necklace down on the table between them, right in the center where the lantern light was strongest, and he looked at Lila, not as a stranger now, but as someone who had carried a truth too long to keep it alone. You brought this here for a reason, he said, and she nodded once. A shadow moved past the window, slow and deliberate, and a voice called from outside, calm but firm. Elias Carter. It said, we know you are in there. Elias did not move toward the door, did not reach for a weapon. He just stood there, his hand resting on the table beside the necklace, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like stepping back. Then they can come in, he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the silver resting in the light. The silence after his words settled deeper than the sound of the wind, like the house itself was waiting to see if he meant it, and outside, for a brief moment, even the horses seemed to pause, their breathing slow, steady, controlled, the kind of quiet that comes before something shifts. Lila did not move, but her eyes flicked once toward the door, not in fear, not exactly, but in recognition of what was coming next. And Elias reached for the lantern, turning the flame just a fraction higher. So the light filled more of the room, not to reveal anything new, but to make sure nothing could hide in shadow. The knock came then, not loud, not aggressive, just firm, the kind of knock a man uses when he believes he already owns what is on the other side. And Elias walked to the door without hurry, each step measured, the floorboards speaking under his weight in quiet creaks that had not changed in years. He opened it halfway, enough to see, enough to be seen, and the man standing there wore confidence like a coat that had never been tested, tall, broad, his hat pulled low against the fading light, his eyes sharp but calm, and behind him, 2 others waited on their horses, silhouettes against the darkening sky. Evening, Carter, the man said, his voice smooth, practiced, as if he had spoken this way his whole life, as if nothing had ever forced it to change. "We are looking for someone who might have come through here." Elias leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, not blocking the entrance, not inviting it either, just holding the space between. "You found your way here easy enough," he replied, his tone even, carrying no more weight than the words themselves. The man's gaze shifted past him, into the house, scanning without turning his head, the way men do when they expect to see what they came for. And then his eyes landed on Lila, standing by the table, still as stone, the lantern light touching the edge of her face, enough to make her known, not enough to make her vulnerable. Something changed then, not much. Just a tightening around the man's eyes, a brief flicker that passed too quickly for most to notice, but Elias saw it, because he was looking for it. "There you are," the man said, softer now, but not kinder. "You have caused quite a bit of trouble, girl." Lila did not answer, did not lower her gaze. She simply stood there, and that silence carried more strength than any reply could have. Elias pushed the door open a little wider then, stepping back just enough to clear the threshold. "You said you were looking," he said. "Now you found." The man studied him for a second, measuring something that had not been there before, then stepped inside without asking, his boots leaving faint prints of dust across the wooden floor, the other two dismounting outside but not entering, staying close enough to hear, far enough to let this moment belong to the man who led them. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, and for a heartbeat, no one spoke, because the room had changed, the air. Heavier now, shaped by three people carrying three different truths. The man removed his hat slowly, not out of respect, but out of habit, placing it on the corner of the table like he expected it to remain untouched, and his eyes moved again, taking in the room, the walls, the lantern, and then settling on the silver necklace resting at the center of the table. His hand paused just slightly before reaching toward it, not touching, just hovering, as if something about it demanded more caution than he had planned for. "You keep strange company, Carter," he said, his voice returning to that calm, controlled tone. "This does not concern you." Elias stepped forward then, closing the distance just enough to stand on the opposite side of the table, his hand resting near the necklace, not claiming it, but not leaving it alone either. "It concerns me now," he said quietly. The man's eyes lifted to meet his, and for the first time, there was no smoothness left in them, just calculation, quick and sharp. "You do not know what you are stepping into," he replied, and Elias gave a small shake of his head, not in disagreement, but in acceptance. "I know enough," he said. Outside, one of the horses shifted, the sound of leather stretching briefly before settling again, and the man's jaw tightened just a fraction, as if the world beyond this room was reminding him of something he preferred to keep contained. Lila took one step forward then, not large, not sudden, but enough to bring her fully into the light, and when she spoke, her voice did not tremble. "He knows what you did," she said, not accusing, not pleading, just stating what already existed. The man's gaze moved to her again, slower this time, heavier. "You should not have come back," he said, and there was something in those words that hinted at more than just anger, something closer to regret, though it did not stay long enough to be named. Elias reached out then, lifting the necklace from the table and holding it up between them, the metal catching the lantern light, reflecting it in a dull, steady glow. "I have seen this before," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Not here, not in this house, but in a place where a man stood alone and told the truth while everyone else decided not to hear it." The room seemed to narrow around those words, like the past had found a way to fit inside the present. The man did not answer right away, and that silence stretched, filled only by the faint sound of the wind outside and the steady burn of the lantern, until finally he exhaled, slow and measured. "You remember wrong," he said, but the certainty in his voice was not as strong as before. Elias lowered the necklace slightly, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "No," he said, "I remember exactly." And for the first time that night, the balance in the room shifted, not with force, not with noise, but with the simple weight of something that could no longer be denied. The man's gaze did not leave the necklace, but something behind his eyes began to shift, like a door he had kept closed for years was starting to move whether he wanted it to or not. and Elias saw it, not as fear, but as recognition, the kind that comes when a truth steps out of memory and into the room where it can no longer be ignored. The lantern flickered again, the flame bending slightly as a draft slipped through the cracks in the walls, and the light danced across the silver, making it seem almost alive, as if it carried the voice of the man who once wore it. "You are holding on to something that does not belong to you," the man said finally, his voice lower now, less certain, as though each word had to pass through something heavier before reaching the air, and Elias did not answer right away, because he was listening, not just to the words, but to what was missing from them. Lila stood still, her hands now empty at her sides, but there was no weakness in her posture, only a quiet strength that had grown in the space between fear and truth, and she looked at the man not as a daughter looks at a father, but as someone who had stepped beyond that role and could not step back. Outside, one of the riders shifted again, a faint murmur of voices carrying through the wood, too low to understand, but clear enough to remind everyone inside that this moment did not exist alone. It was being watched, measured, waiting to become something more. Elias placed the necklace back on the table, not gently, not harshly, just with purpose, setting it where the light could not ignore it, where no one in the room could pretend it was not there. "It belonged to a man who spoke the truth," he said, his voice steady, not raised, not forced, just certain, and I stood there while no one listened. The words settled into the wood, into the walls, into the space between the three of them, and for a moment, no one moved, because the past had found its place in the present, and it was not leaving. The man's jaw tightened, his hand curling slightly at his side before relaxing again, a small motion, but one that carried more than any sudden movement could have. "You think you understand what happened," he said, but this time it sounded less like a statement and more like something he was trying to convince himself of, and Elias shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "I did not understand it then." He paused, letting that truth settle before continuing. "But I do now." And the difference between those two moments, then and now, stretched across the room like a line that could not be crossed back over. Lila stepped closer to the table, her eyes never leaving the man, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, not just truth, but release, like each word was setting something down she had carried too long. "You said he took something," she said, "but he did not." The man did not interrupt, did not correct her. He simply stood there, and that silence spoke louder than any denial. "You told them he did," she continued, "and they believed you." The words did not rise, did not accuse. They simply existed, and in that existence, they began to reshape the room. Elias watched the man carefully, not looking for anger, not expecting resistance, but waiting for the moment when a man realizes that the ground he has been standing on is not as solid as he thought. The lantern burned steady now, the earlier flicker gone, as if the air itself had settled into what was happening, and the shadows around the edges of the room seemed to draw back, leaving the three figures clear in the light, with nowhere left to hide. "Why bring this here?" the man asked after a long pause, his voice quieter than before, almost tired, and Lila answered without hesitation. "Because you would not say it," she said. "And someone has to." And that was it. No more, no less. Just a simple truth that cut through everything else that had been built around it. Outside, the wind shifted direction, brushing against the house from a new angle, carrying with it the faint sound of distant voices from the riders, still waiting, still watching, but not yet moving, as if even they could feel that something inside this house was deciding more than just what happened next. Elias stepped back from the table, not retreating, but creating space, giving the moment room to unfold without his hands shaping it further, because he understood now that this was not something he could force. It had to come from the man standing across from him. The man looked down at the necklace again, his eyes tracing its worn edges, the small imperfections that time had left behind, and for the first time, his shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in something closer to acceptance, like the weight he had carried without naming was finally being seen. "There are things a man does," he said slowly, each word measured, deliberate, because he believes he is protecting something. He paused, his gaze still fixed downward. "And there are things he does because he is afraid to lose it," He lifted his head then, meeting Lila's eyes, and in that look, there was no anger left, no command, just a quiet reckoning with something that had been waiting longer than either of them wanted to admit. Lila did not step back, did not lower her gaze. She simply stood there, holding that moment steady, and Elias knew then that whatever happened next would not come from force. It would come from the simple, undeniable presence of truth in a room where it had been denied for too long. The night outside deepened, the last light gone from the sky, leaving only the lantern to define what could be seen, and in that small circle of light, 3 lives stood at the edge of something that could not be. Undone, not by words, not by silence, not anymore. The room held its breath as his words settled, not loud, not sharp, but heavy enough to press against the walls like something that had been waiting years to be spoken, and Elias watched the man closely, not as an enemy, not as a stranger, but as someone standing at the edge of a truth he could no longer step away from. The necklace lay between them, catching the lantern light in a steady glow, no longer just an object, but a line drawn across time, connecting what had been denied to what could not be avoided. Outside, the riders shifted again, one horse letting out a low breath that drifted through the night air, the sound reaching inside like a reminder that this moment would not stay contained forever. Lila did not move, her gaze steady, her silence stronger now than any fear that might have once held her back, and Elias could see it clearly. She was no longer running. She had come here to stand. The man exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction more, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not broken, not weak, but stripped of the certainty it once carried. "You think saying it now changes anything," he said. Though the words did not carry the weight of a challenge anymore, they sounded closer to a question he had not meant to ask. Elias rested his hand lightly on the table, his fingers close to the necklace but not touching it, and he answered without raising his voice. "It does not change what happened," he said, "but it changes what happens next." And that difference hung in the air, quiet but undeniable. The man looked at Lila again, longer this time, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not anger, not authority, but recognition, the kind that comes when a man realizes he is no longer being followed, no longer being obeyed, but being seen. "You should have left this buried," he said, though the words lacked force, like they had lost their footing before they reached the surface, and Lila shook her head slowly. "It was never buried," she replied, "only hidden." And that distinction settled into the room like dust in still air, impossible to ignore. Once noticed, Elias stepped back another half step, giving space not just between bodies, but between decisions, because he understood now that nothing he said would matter as much as what the man chose to do next. The lantern burned steady, its light no longer flickering, as if the air itself had decided to hold still until this moment resolved into something final. Outside, a voice called softly, one of the riders, not urgent, not commanding, just checking, and the man did not answer. He did not even turn his head, because whatever was happening inside this room had pulled him away from the world waiting beyond the door. His eyes dropped to the necklace again, and this time, he reached for it. Not with hesitation, but with a slow, deliberate motion, his fingers closing around the silver as if he were finally willing to feel its weight. He held it there, turning it slightly in the light, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow around that single point, the past and the present meeting in the space between his hand and the table. He did not take anything. He said quietly, the words barely above a whisper, but clear, unmistakable, and once spoken, they did not leave, they settled into the room with a kind of finality that no denial could reach. Lila's breath shifted, not sharply, not in surprise, but in release, like something inside her had been waiting for those words longer than she had known, and Elias felt it too, not as relief, but as a shift, a line crossed that could not be undone. The man's hand tightened slightly around the necklace, then loosened, and he set it back down where it had been. But it no longer looked the same. It no longer carried only silence. It carried acknowledgment. "We told them," he did. He continued, his voice still low, still controlled, but no longer hiding. "Because it was easier than admitting we were wrong." He paused, his gaze lifting slowly, meeting Elias, then Lila. And once it was said, It could not be taken back. The truth of that hung heavy, not as an excuse, not as justification, but as something plain and unavoidable. Outside, the wind moved again, brushing against the house, carrying the faint scent of dust and leather, and the riders remained where they were, waiting, though now the waiting felt different, less certain, as if something inside the house had already begun to change what would happen beyond it. Elias did not move closer, did not reach for anything. He simply stood there, listening, because this was not his moment to lead. It was his moment to witness, to stand where he had once stood before and choose differently by not stepping away. Lila's eyes did not leave the man, and when she spoke, her voice carried neither anger nor accusation, only truth. "Then say it again," she said. "Not here." She gestured slightly toward the door, toward the world beyond the walls, out there, and the words did not demand, they invited. But the weight behind them made it clear that this invitation was also a choice that could not be avoided. The man's jaw tightened once more, not in resistance, but in the quiet effort of a man measuring what it would cost to follow through, and for a long moment, he did not answer, the silence stretching between them, filled only by the steady burn of the lantern and the distant breath of horses waiting in the dark. Elias watched him carefully, not expecting certainty, not expecting ease, because he knew that the hardest part of truth was not finding it. It was carrying it into the light where others could see. The man finally turned his head toward the door, not fully, just enough to acknowledge what waited beyond it, then back to the table, to the necklace, to the two people standing across from him. And in that small movement, something shifted again, quiet but undeniable. "If I walk out there," he said slowly, each word measured, deliberate, "there is no turning back," and Elias answered without hesitation, "There never was." And that was the moment the room changed, not with sound, not with force, but with the simple understanding that the past had finally found its way to the door, and this time, someone was going to open it. For a long moment, no one moved, not because they could not, but because something had finally reached the point where movement meant consequence. And Elias stood with his hand resting lightly on the table, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his fingers, grounding himself in something steady while the air in the room shifted around them. The man's eyes lingered on the necklace one last time before he drew in a slow breath, the kind that comes when a decision has already been made but has not yet been carried out, and he reached for his hat, not with urgency, not with hesitation, just with the quiet acceptance of a man stepping into something he cannot step back from. Lila watched him without blinking, her shoulders still, her stance unchanged. But there was something softer now beneath the strength, not weakness, not relief, but the beginning of release, like a weight she had carried for too long was finally being set down, piece by piece. Outside, the horses shifted again, their hooves pressing into the dirt, the faint sound of leather creaking under movement, and the night had settled fully now, the sky dark and wide above the open land, the kind of darkness that makes every light inside a house feel like a choice. The man moved toward the door, each step measured, not rushed, and when he reached it, his hand rested on the handle for a brief second longer than necessary, as if he was marking the moment, fixing it in his mind before crossing it. Elias did not follow, did not step ahead. He simply turned slightly, giving the man space to move forward, because this was not something that could be led. It had to be chosen. The door opened with a soft creak, and the night air slipped in, cooler now, carrying the scent of dust and distance, and the riders outside straightened in their saddles, their silhouettes sharpening against the faint outline of the horizon. The man stepped out onto the porch, the wood beneath his boots sounding hollow in the quiet, and he paused there, not speaking yet, not moving further, just standing in that narrow space between inside and out, between what had been said and what was about to be heard. Elias and Lila remained inside, just beyond the doorway, the lantern light stretching toward the threshold but not crossing it, leaving the man half in shadow, half in glow, as if the world itself had drawn a line and was waiting to see which side he would stand on. "You found her," one of the riders said, his voice low, not questioning, just stating what he could already see, and the man did not answer right away, his gaze moving from one rider to the other, then out toward the open land beyond them. as if searching for something that was no longer there. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy, filled with everything that had led to this moment. And then he spoke, his voice not raised, not forced, just clear. "We were wrong," he said, and the words carried across the yard in a way that felt larger than their volume, like they had been waiting years to find air. The riders did not react at first, not because they did not hear, but because they were trying to understand what they had just been given. And the man continued, not faster, not louder, just steady. The man back in Red Hollow. He paused, not for effect, but because the name had not been spoken in so long it felt unfamiliar. He did not take anything. The wind moved again, brushing across the porch, carrying the words further into the dark. And something in the stillness beyond seemed to shift, like the land itself had been listening. One of the riders shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking softly. "What are you saying?" he asked, not angry, not yet, just uncertain, and the man answered without turning away. "I am saying we told them he did, and it was not true." And there it was, not hidden, not softened, just placed in the open where it could not be taken back. Inside, Elias felt the weight of those words settle, not as a release, not as victory, but as something closer to balance, like a scale that had been tilted too long was finally beginning to even out. And he glanced at Lila, seeing in her face the same quiet shift, the same understanding that this moment was not about punishment, but about truth finding its place. Outside, the riders looked at each other, brief, quick glances that spoke of shared history, shared decisions, and now, shared consequences, and the man stood still, not defending, not explaining further, just allowing the words to exist as they were. The night seemed to deepen around them, the darkness no longer empty, but filled with something that had been missing before, something that did not need to be named to be understood. After a long pause, one of the riders exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and looked back toward the house, toward the open door, toward the light that framed Elias and Lila inside. And something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough to show that what had just been said had reached him. No one raised a voice. No one moved to close the distance, because this was not that kind of moment. This was the kind that settles into a place and changes it quietly, without force. The man on the porch lowered his gaze for a second, then lifted it again. Not to the riders this time, but toward the horizon, where the last trace of light had disappeared, leaving only the outline of land against sky. And he stood there as if measuring something beyond what could be seen. Elias remained where he was, not stepping forward, not calling out, because he understood now that nothing more needed to be said from him. The truth had been spoken, and it would carry itself from here. Lila took a slow breath beside him, her shoulders easing just slightly, and, for the first time since she had arrived, she looked not at the man, not at the necklace, but out past the door, into the night that no longer felt like something she had to run through. The wind moved once more, softer now, and the silence that followed was different from the one before, not heavy, not waiting, but settled, like something long overdue had finally found its place. And in that quiet, no one reached for anything. No one turned away, because they all knew, without needing to say it, that nothing would be the same after this night. The words did not echo, they did not need to. They settled into the ground like rain after a long drought, quiet but impossible to ignore, and for a while no one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because anything said too quickly would have broken something that had just begun to mend. The riders remained where they were, their silhouettes still against the night, but the way they sat had changed, not rigid, not certain, just less sure of what they had ridden out to do. And the man on the porch did not move either, his hands resting at his sides, his shoulders no longer carrying the same weight they had when he first stepped inside that house. Elias stood just inside the doorway, the lantern light behind him casting a long shadow across the threshold, and he watched not the men, not the horses, but the space between them, the place where decisions lived before they became actions, and he could feel it now, the shift, subtle but real, like a storm that had passed. Without breaking, leaving the air clearer, quieter, Lila stepped forward then, not past Elias, not onto the porch, but close enough that the night air touched her face, and she looked out at the riders, not with defiance, not with fear, but with something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself, because it already knew where it stood. One of the riders finally dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud, and he did not reach for anything, did not rush forward. He simply took a few steps closer, stopping at the edge of the porch, his gaze moving from the man to Lila, then to Elias, as if trying to understand how this moment had become something different than what he expected. "So that is it," he said, his voice low, not angry, just uncertain. "You bring us all the way out here to say we were wrong." And the man on the porch did not turn away, did not raise his voice. He simply nodded once. "Yes," he said, "that is it." And there was something in the simplicity of that answer that made it harder to argue with than any long explanation ever could. The rider exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool air, and he glanced back at the others, a silent exchange passing between them. Not agreement, not refusal, just recognition that something had shifted and could not be shifted back. Elias felt it too, not as relief, but as a quiet understanding that the moment had moved beyond him, beyond anything he could control, and that was as it should be. Lila's gaze remained steady, and when she spoke, it was not to accuse, not to demand, but to finish what had been started. "He had a name," she said, her voice carrying across the space with a calm that held its own weight, and the man on the porch closed his eyes for just a second, like he was reaching back through time, through memory, through everything he had tried not to remember. "Thomas Hale," he said, the name sounding unfamiliar at first, like it had not been spoken in years, but once it was said, it settled into place, solid, undeniable, and the night seemed to hold it there, letting it be heard, letting it exist. Elias felt something tighten in his chest, not pain, not regret exactly, but something close, something that came from hearing a name that should never have been forgotten. The rider at the edge of the porch shifted, his weight, his expression changing, not dramatically, but enough to show that the name had reached him too, that it had found a place where before there had only been a story without a face. No one spoke after that, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to argue. The truth had been given its shape, its voice, its place, and now it simply existed between them, waiting to be carried forward or left behind. The wind moved through the yard again, softer now, brushing against the house, the fence, the open land beyond, and it felt different, not like something pushing against resistance, but like something moving freely for the first time in a long while. The man on the porch stepped down then, not toward the riders, not toward the house, but into the space between, standing on the ground as if to meet whatever came next without the barrier of wood beneath his feet. And he looked at Lila one last time, not as a father, not as a man in charge, but as someone who had finally heard what needed to be said. She did not nod, did not smile. She simply met his gaze, and in that look there was no forgiveness offered, no apology accepted, just an understanding that the truth had been spoken, and that was where it began. Elias remained where he was, his hand resting against the doorframe now, feeling the worn edge beneath his fingers, and he realized something then, something quiet but clear, that the most important thing he had done that night was not stepping forward, not taking control, but staying where he was and letting the truth find its own way into the open. The riders began to turn their horses slowly, not in retreat, not in defeat, just in a kind of silent agreement that whatever they had come for was no longer here. And the man followed after a moment, his steps measured, his posture no longer carrying the same rigid certainty, but something else, something closer to acceptance. Lila watched them go, her eyes following until the darkness swallowed their shapes, and when she finally looked away, she did not look back at the necklace, did not look at the door, she looked out at the land beyond, as if seeing it for the first time without the weight she had carried before. Elias closed the door gently behind them, the sound soft, final, and he stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet that followed, not empty, not heavy, but settled, like something long out of place had finally been returned. The lantern burned steady on the table, its light warm against the wood, and the necklace lay where it had been placed, no longer just a reminder of what had happened, but a mark of what had been set right, not by force, not by anger, but by something far quieter and far harder to carry. And in that quiet, neither of them spoke, because they both knew, without needing to say it, that the night had changed more than just a story. It had changed the way it would be remembered. The quiet that followed did not feel empty. It felt earned, like the land itself had been waiting for something to be said out loud before it could finally rest. And Elias stood for a long moment with his hand still on the door, feeling the worn wood beneath his palm, listening to the fading sound of hooves dissolving into the distance, each step softer than the last until there was nothing left but wind and open space. He turned slowly, not with urgency, but with the weight of someone who understood that what had just happened would not leave with the night. It would stay, settle into the bones of this place the same way all truth eventually does, quiet but permanent. Lila had not moved far. She stood near the table where the lantern still burned, its light steady and warm, casting soft shadows that no longer felt like they were hiding anything. And the necklace remained there, untouched, resting in the center as if it had finally found the place it belonged. For a while, neither of them spoke, not because they could not, but because there was nothing that needed to be rushed into words. Some moments do not need to be explained. They need to be allowed to exist fully before anything else is added. The wind moved gently through the cracks in the walls, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant sage, and somewhere far off, a night bird called once before settling back into silence. The kind of sound that reminds you the world keeps turning. Even when something inside it has shifted, Elias stepped closer to the table, his boots soft against the wooden floor, and he looked down at the necklace, studying it not as a mystery anymore, but as something complete, something that had finished its purpose, and he reached out, not to take it, but to turn it slightly so the light caught it differently, softer now, less sharp, like the story it carried had changed its shape. "It will not follow you anymore," he said quietly, not looking at Lila at first, but speaking into the space between them. And when he did lift his gaze, he saw that she understood, not because of the words, but because of what had already happened. She stepped forward then, slow and deliberate, her hand hovering over the necklace for a moment before she picked it up, her fingers closing around it with care, not like someone reclaiming something lost, but like someone choosing what to do with it next. "I did not come to keep it," she said, her voice calm, steady, and Elias nodded once, because he had known that before she said it. Some things do not belong to the person who carries them. They belong to what they reveal. She looked at the door then, the one that had just closed behind the men who had carried the weight of that truth for so long. And there was no fear in her expression now, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that whatever came next would not be shaped by what had been hidden before. "What happens now?" she asked, not as a question seeking direction, but as someone marking the moment where one path ends and another begins. Elias leaned lightly against the edge of the table, his eyes drifting briefly toward the window, where the darkness stretched wide and open, and he took a slow breath before answering. "Now it travels," he said, and she tilted her head slightly, not confused, just waiting. "Truth does not stay in one place," he continued. "Not once it has been spoken where others can hear it." He glanced back at her, his expression steady, grounded. "It moves through people, through towns, through the way stories get told from one voice to another." He paused, letting that settle. "And it changes what comes after, even if no one talks about it again the same way." Lila listened without interrupting, her fingers still resting lightly around the necklace. And for a moment she looked younger, not because she had lost her strength, but because she no longer had to carry something that did not belong to her. She walked toward the small shelf near the wall where the water jug stood, and beside it, a simple wooden box, worn at the edges from years of use. And she opened it without asking, not out of disrespect, but because something in this place had already made room for her to do so. Inside were small things, not valuable, not rare, but meaningful in the way only quiet objects can be. A folded piece of cloth, a rusted button, a strip of leather, items that held stories without needing to speak them. She placed the necklace inside, gently, closing the lid with care, and when she stepped back, she did not look at it again, because she no longer needed to. Elias watched that without comment, because he understood what she had done. She had not hidden it. She had placed it where it could rest, where it would not be carried as a burden, but kept as a reminder of something that had been set right. The lantern flame shifted slightly, then steadied again, and the room felt different now. Not lighter, not heavier, just balanced, like something that had been leaning too far in one direction had finally found its center. Lila turned toward the door once more, but this time not as someone who had just arrived, not as someone being chased, but as someone ready to leave on her own terms, and she paused there, her hand resting briefly on the frame, feeling the same worn wood Elias had touched earlier. "Thank you," she said, not loudly, not with ceremony, just enough for it to be heard, and Elias gave a small shake of his head, not dismissing it, but setting it aside. "You carried it here," he replied. "I just kept the door open. And that was all. No more, no less." She nodded once, understanding exactly what he meant, and then she stepped outside into the night. The darkness no longer something that hid things, but something that held space for whatever came next. Elias remained inside, watching her go until the shape of her figure blended into the open land, and when she was gone, he closed the door once more, softer this time, the sound barely there. He turned back to the room, to the table, to the lantern, and to the small wooden box now holding something that no longer needed to be carried across miles to be heard. And he stood there for a while, not thinking, not questioning, just present in the quiet that had followed. Outside, the wind moved across the plains again, but this time it did not feel like it was searching for something. It felt like it was moving freely, carrying with it a story that had finally found its voice and would not be lost again. Morning came slow over the plains, not with color, but with a pale light that pushed gently against the edges of the world, and Elias Carter was already awake before the sun had fully risen, standing outside his house with a cup of black coffee in his hand, watching the land stretch out in every direction like it always had, like it always would. The wind moved lighter than it had the night before, carrying no urgency, no weight, just the quiet rhythm of a day beginning, and for the first time in a long while, there was nothing in the air that felt unfinished. The porch creaked softly under his boots as he stepped down into the dirt, the ground still cool from the night, and he walked a few paces out, not because he had somewhere to go, but because the stillness of the morning asked for it. The house behind him stood the same as it had for years, weathered wood, simple structure, nothing that would draw a man's attention twice. And yet it held something now that had not been there before, something not visible, not something a man could point to, but something that had settled into the space the same way dust settles after a storm has passed. He took a slow sip from the cup, letting the bitterness sit on his tongue, grounding him in the present, and his eyes drifted to the far edge of the property where the land dipped slightly before rising again into open hills. And for a moment, he thought he saw movement, just a shadow against the light, but it was gone as quickly as it came, and he did not chase it with his gaze, because some things are meant to pass through without being held. Inside the house, the lantern had burned low, its flame reduced to a small, steady glow, and the wooden box sat where it had been placed, closed, quiet, holding what it needed to hold without asking for attention, and Elias knew it would stay there, not as a secret, not as something hidden, but as something that had already done its work. The memory of the night before did not rush back to him. It did not demand to be relived. It simply existed, settled into the same space as the rest of his past, no longer sharp, no longer pressing, just present. He set the cup down on the edge of the porch railing and ran a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of unshaven skin, the familiar texture of a life lived mostly alone, and he let out a quiet breath that did not carry tension, did not carry relief, just a simple release of air into the morning. The sound of hooves reached him then, faint at first, then clearer, steady and unhurried, and he turned his head slightly, not surprised, not alarmed, just aware, because this land did not bring visitors without reason, even in the quiet after something had changed. A single rider came into view along the far line of the property, moving at a slow pace, not hiding, not rushing, just traveling with purpose, and as the figure drew closer, Elias recognized the shape, the posture, the way the rider held the reins, steady and controlled. It was one of the men from the night before, the one who had stepped down from his horse and listened, really listened, and now he approached without the others, without the weight of a group behind him, just one man and his horse crossing open ground. Elias did not move to meet him halfway, did not call out. He simply stood where he was, waiting, because whatever this was, it had chosen its own path to get here. The rider slowed as he reached the yard, bringing the horse to a stop a few feet from the porch, and for a moment he did not dismount. He just sat there, looking at Elias with an expression that carried something different than before, not uncertainty, not confidence, something quieter, something that had been shaped overnight. Then he swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud, and he removed his hat, not out of habit this time, but with intention, holding it loosely at his side. "Morning," he said, his voice lower than it had been the night before, not because he was forcing it, but because something in him had changed the way it came out. Elias gave a small nod, his eyes steady. "Morning," he replied, and the space between them held no tension, no edge, just a simple acknowledgment that they both knew why he was here. The rider glanced briefly toward the house, toward the door that had been opened the night before, then back to Elias. And he took a slow breath before speaking again. "Word travels fast," he said, not as a warning, not as a complaint, just a fact. And Elias leaned lightly against the porch railing, his arms resting comfortably. "It always does," he answered. The rider nodded once, looking down at the ground for a moment, then back up, and there was something in his eyes now that had not been there before, something closer to understanding than anything else. "They are talking about it," he continued. "Back in Red Hollow." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. About the name, about what was said. And the morning air carried those words without resistance, letting them settle the same way the night before had settled everything else. Elias did not react quickly, did not press. He simply listened, because he knew this was not about him. It never had been. The rider shifted his weight slightly, his hand tightening around the brim of his hat for just a second before relaxing again. "Some of them remember," he said quietly. "Not all, but enough." And there was something in that statement that felt important. Not complete, not finished, but moving in the right direction. Elias looked out, across the land again, the sun now higher, casting longer light across the open space. And he nodded once, not in approval, not in agreement, just in recognition that truth, once spoken, does not stay still. The rider followed his gaze for a moment, then spoke again, softer this time. "It does not change what happened." And Elias answered without turning back. "No," he said, "but it changes what comes after." And the rider let out a breath that sounded like he had been holding it longer than he realized. They stood there for a moment in the quiet of the morning, two men who had seen something shift and knew it would not settle back the way it had been. And the wind moved lightly through the yard, carrying no weight, no urgency, just the steady rhythm of a world that keeps moving forward. The rider placed his hat back on his head, adjusting it slightly, then gave a small nod, not formal, not stiff, just enough to mark the end of something. And he turned back toward his horse, swinging up into the saddle with practiced ease. He did not say anything more, and neither did Elias, because there was nothing left to add that would matter more than what had already been done. The horse turned, stepping back onto the path it had come from, and the rider did not look back as he rode away, not out of disrespect, but because he did not need to. Whatever he had come to carry, he was already taking it with him. Elias watched until the figure became small against the open land, then disappeared into the distance, and when he finally turned back toward the house, the morning felt steady, grounded, unchanged in all the ways that mattered, and yet different in the one way that could not be. Undone, he picked up the cup from the railing, now cool, and took one last sip before setting it down again. And for a moment he stood there, not thinking, not searching, just present in the quiet that had followed, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, a story had begun to travel, and it would not stop, not this time. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last traces of night until the land stretched wide and clear under a pale blue sky. And Elias Carter moved through his morning the same way he always had, slow, deliberate, every motion grounded in routine. But there was something beneath it now. Something quieter than thought, something that did not need to be named to be felt. He stepped inside the house, the wooden floor steady beneath his boots, and the air held the faint warmth left behind by the lantern that had burned through the night. And for a moment he paused just inside the doorway, letting his eyes settle on the small wooden box resting on the shelf, untouched, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what it carried. He did not go to it right away, did not reach for it, because he understood now that some things do not need to be handled again to remain real. They stay where they are meant to stay, doing their work without asking for attention. He poured fresh water into a basin, the sound clear in the quiet room, and washed his hands slowly, the coolness grounding him, pulling him further into the present, away from the edges of memory that had defined the night before. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying distant sounds that belonged to the wider world, faint voices, the movement of cattle, the rhythm of life continuing beyond the boundaries of his land. And it reminded him that nothing that had happened here would stay contained. It had already begun to move outward, carried by those who had heard it, shaped by those who would repeat it. He stepped back out onto the porch, the sunlight now stronger, casting sharp lines across the ground, and he leaned lightly against the railing, his gaze moving across the horizon without searching for anything in particular. Time passed without urgency, the kind of passing that does not demand to be noticed. And for a while there was only the steady presence of the land, the sound of wind, the quiet rhythm of a day unfolding. Then, from the far edge of the property, another figure appeared, smaller than the rider before, moving at a measured pace, not hurried, not hesitant, and Elias straightened slightly, not out of concern, but out of recognition, because something in the way that figure moved told him this was not chance. This was intention. As the figure came closer, the details became clearer. A woman, older, her posture strong despite the years carried in her frame, her hair streaked with gray, tied back simply, and she rode without excess, no decoration, no display, just purpose. She did not call out as she approached, did not signal her arrival. She simply rode up to the yard and brought her horse to a quiet stop, her eyes taking in the house, the land, and finally settling on Elias with a calm that did not need to prove itself. He stepped down from the porch, closing the distance by a few feet, not too close, not distant either, just enough to meet her presence without crowding it, and he gave a small nod. "Morning," he said, his voice even, respectful. Without being formal, she inclined her head slightly in return, her gaze steady. "You are the one they spoke about," she said, her voice carrying the kind of weight that comes from being heard without needing to be raised. Elias did not answer right away, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that what she had come for was not a simple exchange of words. It was something else, something that required space to unfold. "They said something changed here last night," she continued, her eyes moving briefly toward the house, then back to him. "And that a name was spoken." Elias nodded once. "It was," he replied. The woman studied him for a moment longer, then dismounted, her movements steady, controlled, and she stepped forward, her boots pressing lightly into the dirt, leaving marks that would fade with the wind but existed for now, just like everything else. "I knew him," she said simply, and those 3 words carried more weight than anything that had been said so far. That morning, because they connected the past not just to memory, but to a living presence standing here now. Elias felt that connection settle, not sharply, but deeply, and he gave a slight tilt of his head, not in question, but in acknowledgment. "Then you know what was not said," he replied, and she gave a faint nod. "I know what was said," she corrected gently. "And what was believed," she paused, her gaze steady, "but not what was true." And there it was, the reason she had come, not for confrontation, not for explanation, but for something quieter, something more lasting. Elias turned slightly, gesturing toward the house, not as an invitation of comfort, but as an opening, and she stepped forward. Without hesitation, crossing the threshold into the space that had held the truth the night before. Inside, the air felt different in the daylight, the shadows softer, the edges less defined, and the wooden box remained where it had been placed, still, silent, carrying what it carried without display. The woman's eyes moved to it almost immediately, not because it stood out, but because something in her recognized its presence. The way a person recognizes a place where something important has been left behind. She stepped closer, her hand hovering just above it before resting lightly on the lid, not opening it. Not yet, just feeling its weight, its place in the room. "You kept it," she said, not as a question, and Elias leaned against the doorway, his arms resting loosely at his sides. "I kept the space for it," he answered. She nodded slowly, her fingers still on the wood. And for a moment the room held a different kind of silence. Not heavy, not waiting, but reflective, like a pause in a conversation that had not yet finished speaking. Outside, the wind moved again, carrying with it the faint echo of distant voices, and somewhere beyond the hills, the story continued to travel, moving from one person to another, shaping itself with each telling, but holding on to the truth that had finally been given a voice. The woman lifted her hand from the box and turned back toward Elias, her expression unchanged, steady, grounded. "Then it is not lost," she said, and Elias shook his head once. "No," he replied quietly, "not anymore." And in that moment, the house, the land, and the morning itself seemed to settle into something new, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, because it had already begun to live beyond this place. The woman did not open the box right away, and that restraint said more than any hurried motion could have, because she understood the weight of what rested inside was not something to be handled lightly, not something to be taken as proof or possession, but something to be acknowledged first, fully, before it was ever touched again. Elias remained by the doorway, the morning light falling across his shoulders, drawing a quiet line between the outside world and the stillness of the room. And he watched her not with expectation, but with the patience of someone who knew that this moment belonged to her more than it did to him. She traced the edge of the wooden lid with her fingers, feeling the worn grain beneath her skin, and for a brief second her eyes closed, not in grief, not in hesitation, but in a kind of recognition that had been denied too long and was now finally allowed to exist. He was not a man who spoke much, she said softly, her voice steady but carrying something deeper beneath it. But when he did, he spoke plainly. And Elias nodded once, because he remembered that too. Not clearly at first, but now it came back in pieces that fit together more easily than before, a voice that did not rise, a presence that did not demand, and yet had been ignored all the same. The woman lifted her hand slightly, then let it rest again on the lid, not opening it. Not yet, and she turned her head toward Elias, her gaze calm but searching in a way that did not feel intrusive, just honest. "You stood there," she said, not accusing, not asking, just stating what had already been said in a different form the night before, and Elias did not turn away from it this time, did not shift his weight or break eye contact. He simply answered, "I did." And there was no defense in his voice, no explanation, just the truth as it was. She studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not of approval, not of judgment, just acknowledgment. And that acknowledgment settled into the space between them with a quiet finality that did not need to be spoken again. Outside, the wind moved across the open land, carrying the distant sound of something alive beyond this place, a reminder that the world did not pause for reflection. It continued, always, but sometimes it carried something new within it, something that changed the way it moved forward. The woman finally lifted the lid of the box, slow and deliberate, and the hinges made a soft sound that seemed louder in the quiet room, not because of the noise itself, but because of what it revealed, the necklace resting inside among the other small objects, no longer hidden, no longer lost, but placed where it could be seen for what it was. She did not reach for it immediately. She let her eyes settle on it first, taking in its shape, its stillness, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow again, not with tension this time, but with focus, as if everything had drawn inward to this one small point of truth. "They said he was passing through," she continued, her voice softer now, but not weaker, "that he did not belong, that he had taken something that was not his." She paused, her gaze still on the necklace. "And I remember thinking how easily they said it, how quickly it became something everyone accepted." Elias felt that memory settle again, not sharp anymore, not cutting, but present, undeniable. And he understood then that what had happened that night had not only changed the future, it had begun to reshape the past, giving it a form that could finally be seen clearly. The woman reached into the box then, her fingers closing around the necklace with care, lifting it into the light, and the silver caught the morning sun now instead of the lantern flame, its surface reflecting something softer, something steadier, as if the truth it carried had settled into it fully. She held it for a moment, not as possession, not as proof, but as connection, and then she lowered it slightly, letting it rest against her palm. "He told me once," she said quietly, "that truth does not need to be loud to be heard. Just needs someone willing to carry it long enough." And those words hung in the air, not as something new, but as something that had finally found its place. Elias shifted slightly in the doorway, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just adjusting his stance as the weight of those words settled into him. Because he understood now that carrying truth did not always mean speaking first. Sometimes it meant staying when everything else told you to leave. The woman looked up at him then, her expression unchanged. But there was something in her eyes that had not been there before, something that did not need to be named. "You stayed," she said, and Elias gave a small shake of his head, not denying it, but clarifying. "I did not leave," he replied, and she nodded once, understanding the difference. Outside, the sun continued its slow rise, casting longer light across the land, and the shadows that had once stretched across the night were gone, replaced by something clearer, something that did not hide what stood before it. The woman placed the necklace back into the box, not closing the lid immediately, but letting it rest there, visible, no longer something that needed to be kept out of sight, and she stepped back, her hands at her sides, her posture steady. "It will be told differently now," she said, not as a hope, not as a question, but as a certainty that had already begun to take shape beyond this place. Elias looked out past her, through the open doorway, toward the wide stretch of land where the story had already started to travel, carried by voices that would shape it in their own way, but anchored now by something that could not be undone. "It already is," he answered, quietly, and the room held that truth the same way it had held all the others, not with resistance, not with doubt, but with a quiet acceptance that what had been set in motion would not be stopped. The woman closed the lid of the box gently, the sound soft, final, and when she turned toward the door, she did not hesitate. She did not look back, because she knew what she had come for was no longer missing. It had been found, spoken, and placed where it belonged. And as she stepped out into the sunlight, the house behind her remained still, grounded, holding within it not just the memory of what had happened, but the quiet proof that truth, once carried far enough, always finds its way home. The door closed behind her with the same quiet certainty it had the night before, but this time it did not carry tension, it carried completion, and Elias Carter stood where he was for a long moment, listening not for what might come next, but for what had already settled into place. The house felt different in the daylight, not because anything had changed in its structure, the same worn boards, the same narrow windows, the same steady table in the center, but because the weight it held had shifted from something hidden to something known, and that difference moved through the space like a breath finally released. He walked slowly to the shelf and rested his hand on the wooden box, not opening it, not needing to, just feeling the presence of what it contained, and for a moment he allowed himself to remember clearly, not in fragments, not in pieces, but fully, the day that had stayed buried for so long, the crowd, the silence, the way no one stepped forward, including him. Outside, the wind carried a different sound now, not the distant uncertainty of before, but the quiet rhythm of voices traveling across land, from one place to another, carrying the story in forms that would change but never fully erase what had been said. Time moved forward the way it always does, steady, without asking permission, and by midday the sun stood high, casting hard shadows across the yard, and Elias found himself sitting on the edge of the porch, his elbows resting on his knees, looking out at the same stretch of land he had watched for years, but seeing it now without the same weight behind his eyes. He did not expect anything more to come that day, not visitors, not questions, because the kind of truth that had been spoken does not return immediately with answers. It travels first, it settles, it reshapes quietly before it comes back in forms that can be seen. And yet, as the afternoon stretched, he noticed something small, something easy to miss if a man was not paying attention. A figure walking along the far edge of the road, not riding, not hurried, just walking with a steady pace. And as it drew closer, Elias recognized the posture, the rhythm of movement, the way the steps carried purpose without urgency. It was Lila. She approached without hesitation, her path direct, her expression calm. And when she reached the yard, she did not stop at the edge. She walked all the way to the porch, standing just a few feet from him, the sun casting light across her face, revealing not the strain of the night before, but something quieter, something more grounded. Elias stood slowly, not surprised, not questioning, just acknowledging her return with a small nod, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the space between them did not need to be filled immediately. "I went back," she said finally, her voice steady, and Elias did not ask where, because he already knew. Red Hollow was not far enough to escape what had begun there. Not anymore. She continued, her eyes steady on his. "They are talking about it." And there was no doubt in her tone, no uncertainty, just the simple truth of something already in motion. Elias leaned lightly against the porch post, his gaze shifting briefly toward the horizon, then back to her. "They will," he said, and she nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition of something already unfolding. "Some did not want to hear it," she added, her voice quieter now, "but they could not ignore it." And Elias understood that too, because truth does not need acceptance to exist, it only needs presence. She looked past him then, toward the open doorway, toward the interior of the house where the box rested on the shelf, and for a brief moment her expression shifted, not in doubt, not in hesitation, but in reflection, as if she was measuring something within herself against what had already been done. "I did not leave it behind," she said, and Elias followed her gaze, understanding before she needed to explain, and he gave a small nod. "You did not bring it to leave it," he replied, and she stepped forward, crossing the threshold once more, moving into the house with the same steady presence she had carried before. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the quiet stillness of afternoon, and the box sat where it had been, unchanged, waiting without urgency. She walked to it and opened it without pause, her fingers sure, her movement unhesitating, and when she lifted the necklace again, it did not seem as heavy as before, not because its weight had changed, but because its purpose had. She turned it slightly in the light, the silver catching the sun now instead of lantern flame, and for a moment she held it there, not as something to be hidden, not as something to be protected, but as something to be carried forward. "It is not finished," she said quietly, and Elias remained near the doorway, watching, not interfering, not questioning, because he understood now that the story did not end with the truth being spoken. It continued in what was done with it. "It has been said here," she continued, "but it must be known there." And she did not need to name the place, because they both knew. Red Hollow was not just a location, it was where the silence had lived the longest. Elias took a slow breath, the weight of her words settling into him, and he nodded once, not as permission, not as approval, but as acknowledgment that what she was choosing was the next step that had always been waiting. She placed the necklace back into the box for a moment, not to leave it, but to gather it properly, to carry it with intention, and then she closed the lid and lifted the box itself, holding it carefully, as if it were something that deserved to be carried whole, not in pieces. She turned back toward him, her expression steady, and there was no hesitation in her voice when she spoke again. "They will hear it," she said, and Elias met her gaze, his own steady, grounded. "They already have," he replied softly, and she gave a small nod, understanding that what had begun could not be undone, only carried forward. She stepped past him, out into the sunlight once more, the box held securely in her hands, and this time when she walked away, there was no sense of leaving something behind, only the quiet certainty of bringing something where it had always needed to go. Elias stood at the doorway, watching her until the distance softened her shape into the horizon, and when she was gone, he did not step forward, did not follow, because he knew that his part had already been played, not in action, but in staying, in allowing, in holding the space where truth could finally stand. The wind moved across the land again, steady, unburdened, and the house behind him remained as it always had, but the silence within it had changed, no longer something that hid what was missing, but something that held what had been found. And out beyond the hills, a story continued its path, no longer waiting to be told, but already being heard. The sun began to fall again by the time the land finally went quiet, Not the empty kind of quiet that comes from absence, but the settled kind that follows when something long unsettled has found its place. And Elias Carter stood at the edge of his porch with his hands resting loosely at his sides, watching the horizon the way he always had. Except now he was no longer waiting for something he could not name. The wind moved across the plains with a softer touch, brushing through the dry grass, carrying with it the faint echo of distant life, voices too far to hear clearly, but close enough to know they were there. And somewhere beyond those hills, in a town that had once decided too quickly what truth looked like, something had begun to shift. Red Hollow did not change all at once. Places like that never do. But stories move differently than men. They slip through cracks. They pass from one voice to another. And once they carry a name, once they carry a truth spoken clearly enough, they do not disappear again. Not completely. By the second day, the name had been said in more than one place, quietly at first, then with a little more certainty, not because everyone believed it, but because no one could ignore it anymore. And that was how change began out here, not with noise, not with force, but with the slow refusal to keep pretending nothing had happened. Elias did not go there to see it. He did not need to, because he understood something most men did not, that once truth finds its footing, it walks on its own. It does not need to be followed. It only needs to be allowed. He moved through his work that afternoon with the same steady rhythm, checking the fence line, tending to the small tasks that filled his days, and each step felt the same as it always had, but lighter in a way that did not draw attention to itself, just enough to notice if a man paid close attention. The house behind him stood quiet, the door closed, the interior holding nothing more than it needed to, and the shelf where the wooden box had rested now sat empty, not abandoned, not missing, just complete, as if its purpose had been fulfilled and carried onward. As the light began to lower again, stretching shadows across the ground, Elias found himself pausing near the fence, his gaze drifting out across the land. And for a moment he thought of the man whose name had been spoken, not as a memory tied to a single day, but as something that now lived beyond that moment, something that had been returned to the world where it belonged. He did not say the name out loud. He did not need to, because it no longer depended on him to be heard. Somewhere far beyond the rise of the hills, Lila walked into that town again, not as someone passing through, not as someone asking to be heard, but as someone carrying something that had already begun to speak for itself. And she did not raise her voice. She did not demand anything. She simply stood where people could see her and let the truth arrive in its own time, carried by those who had already begun to question what they once accepted without thought. Some looked away, some listened, some pretended it did not matter. But none of them could say they had not heard it, and that was enough, more than enough, because silence had already lost its hold. Back on the ranch, the evening settled slowly, the sky deepening into gold, and then into something darker, and Elias returned to the porch, the same place where he had stood so many nights before, except now there was nothing pressing against him, nothing waiting to be uncovered, only the quiet presence of a world that had shifted just enough to feel different. He rested his hand against the railing, the wood worn smooth under his palm, and he let out a slow breath that carried no weight, no regret, just the steady rhythm of a man who had chosen to stay when it mattered. The wind moved again, brushing past him, carrying with it the faint scent of distance, of movement, of something continuing beyond what he could see. And he understood then that this was how it ended, not with a sound, not with a moment that could be pointed to and named, but with the simple fact that something once hidden was now known, and nothing would ever return it to silence. He turned back toward the house as the last light slipped away, stepping inside without hesitation, without pause, and the door closed behind him with the same quiet certainty it always had. But this time it did not hold anything in. It simply marked the space where one part of a story had ended and another had already begun. Out on the plains, the night settled again, vast and steady, and somewhere beyond the reach of that land, a name was still being spoken, not loudly, not by everyone, but enough to be remembered, enough to be carried forward, and out here. That was all justice ever needed to be.